Our first question is to both of our panelists, and just please go starting with Deepthi. Introduce yourself and let us know what drew you to the work of engaging your fellow citizens.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's really great to be here. So my name is Deepthi Welaratna, and my work currently is that I have been working with a group called Courage California on a voter guide, a progressive voter guide for the state of California. I am also the founder of Thicket Labs, which is a participatory people-driven design platform and audience research firm. So the through line in all of my work is really is engagement of people. So I've worked at the intersection of communities and technology for a very long time. And what initially drew me to that work is being in California. I actually grew up in the Bay Area where had a lot of really amazing opportunities. But what I found was going through school, there's such a range of people in California, so many immigrants, and the opportunities are just so unequal. So that kind of drew me in the first place and has been a through line in my work. And I think, this year has been a particular challenge in that area. So thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Deepthi. Kelly.
Hi everyone, my name is Kelly McBride. I am joining you from Edinburgh in Scotland today, and I'm the director of an international non-profit organisation in Scotland called Democratic Society. I also work on open government projects across the organisation. For me, the thing that really got me into the work that I'm going to tell you about in the moment, I think started from personal experience of, I feel like being excluded from spaces where decisions were being made about my life, but also being involved in activism and social action, particularly around different human rights issues. And I ended up doing a bunch of work around community engagement, youth work and social action. And it was actually experiences that I had working at the local level in particular that led me to look into organisations that were interested in different ways of decision-making, involving people in decision-making, which led me to the organisation I work for today, which is the Democratic Society. So DemSoc is an organisation that's been going for around 10 years now, but it's been through quite the evolution in that time. I've been there for about 5 years myself. I was one of the first group of staff that worked there. And we've definitely seen a difference in kind of the interest and attitudes to different ways of involving people in decision-making, particularly from policymakers over the span of that 5 years. So I feel like we've gone from kind of knocking on doors, trying to tell people about the different ways to do this, to institutions, decision-makers themselves now exploring the ways to involve people. And I'm sure there's lots of different reasons about that. So we started in the UK, but we're now have been working around 24 different countries across Europe. We have people that are locally rooted in local places doing projects, which is really important to us. But we work across different levels of government and power and are really interested in the interconnections between the local, the national and other sites of decision-making and power. And we've done around, well over actually now 150 projects. So essentially we're working across Europe at every level to open up new democratic opportunities, and we're really interested in that connection between people and power. We consider ourselves a networked organisation, which basically means that we work across different spaces and across a team, share that learning, share that knowledge of what we're experiencing in different places. And we're very much working in the realm of what you may hear is called participatory or sometimes deliberative democracy. But I believe I'm going to come on to talk about that shortly.
Indeed, you are. So the first of the prepared questions, for those that may not be aware, Kelly, could you give us a brief overview of what participatory or deliberative democracy is, and an example or two of the work that you just mentioned that DemSoc is involved in?
Sure. I think the first thing I should say is that I find different people have different understandings of what participatory democracy means. And if you are into reading the academic literature, there's a few different takes on it. When I talk about participatory democracy, I'm talking about stuff that goes beyond just standard public consultations. And I'm talking about the different ways that you can bring people together to make and shape the decisions that affect their lives. And that could be connected into institutional led processes where decisions need to be made. So that's government convening a space and inviting people to participate. But it can also be community led and driven by social movements. But really it's about that connection for people to come in to make and shape decisions that affect their lives. And that is also beyond elections, so in those spaces that exist outside of representative democracy. I personally approach it as a complement to representative democracy, so where we elect our officials, but I'm very, very aware that other people advocate for it to be a bit of a replacement for that. But my personal standpoint is that I think that it can really help governments make better informed decisions, it can connect communities, it can support them to also be more responsive. I think there is a sense that the approaches that I'm sure I'll touch on today could do lots of different things, not least, again, support and enable communities and people to come together to learn, to become leaders, really, in different spaces. But we're seeing that it can help support people to understand and to, in some cases, increase their trust in government and how decisions are made. And that's partly because people become more aware of the processes that have gone through in decision making, and there's opportunity to receive feedback and to understand why particular courses of action were not taken. But it can also help to direct resources to communities with greater needs and redirect resources to the places where they're needed the most, among other things. So I think one example that I'll mention now, which is something I know is definitely happening across the United States, is participatory budgeting. So that's one particular example of participatory democracy, and that's where people can decide how to spend part of a public or a community budget. And within that, there can be what we call deliberative elements. So that's where people have the opportunity to come together, to learn, to discuss, and to decide perhaps a particular course of action or a set of recommendations. So in those deliberative processes, if that's what I talk about, what I mean is that process of people coming together to discuss, to learn, and to make recommendations or a decision about a course of action. And all of these participatory democracy processes or methods that are used, they can be done short term. So, that could be people voting on those local proposals for that budget, or they can be longer term. So people coming together to learn about and discuss community priorities before they then go into making recommendations and voting. And I'd say those deliberative methods are reported as becoming increasingly popular and prevalent in some parts of the world, but definitely in Scotland. So I'll touch on some of that work that's happening in Scotland. But I would say that DemSoc as an organisation, we are not proponents of one particular method of participatory democracy. We work in lots of different contexts, and we understand the importance of context and how you need to work with people to adapt the things that you do to processes that are suitable in that space. And we bring in lots of different methods. So we're not kind of sold on one particular thing. We're not working on one particular kind of method, but we're looking at the interconnections between them all, and basically how you can bring together the different discussions and spaces that decisions are made and involve people in those processes to help shape them, essentially.
Thank you for that. So Deepthi, from a slightly different perspective on engaging the citizenry, as a strategic designer that has created collaborative innovation programs in the past, how did this background help you in your efforts to re-envision the Courage California voter guide, and also probably give us a little bit of an overview of what that voter guide, or what the Courage California mission is, which led to the voter guide?
Sure, absolutely. So Courage California as an organization has been around for a number of years in California. California is a huge state with a huge population, and what Courage has done has actually varied over the years. So when it first started, it actually was focused specifically on gay rights, and specifically the fight to legalize gay marriage. I had actually originally encountered them working at an agency in New York that was supporting their digital campaign work many, many years ago. And so coming back around and meeting them late last year, they were looking for someone to help them take what they called the Courage Voter Guide and to really amplify it transform it completely. So in California, in terms of the political landscape, it's important to understand what sort of is important at the state level in terms of elections. So we have a system called propositions, where we put forward these statewide measures that are very high profile and very large, and often have massive amounts of money put behind them that really direct the overall state of the state. So for example, we did have a statewide proposition to legalize gay marriage and then to ban it. We've had affirmative action was a fight in 1996 that came, and then this year it was back on the ballot. It was made illegal in 1996, and then it was proposed to make it legal again this year. We had a very important proposition called Prop 22, which is around how gig workers are treated, whether they're considered employees with rights to benefits and paid leave and other types of protection, or treated as independent contractors and not given any of those benefits. And the companies, the industries, so in this case, Uber and Lyft, who are behind them, pour tons of money. In this case, they actually put in about $184 million into advertising across the state to pass this and save them a ton of money. And I'm just looking, thank you for sharing that on affirmative action. The issues that I'm talking about are very specific to the US context. So the Courage Voter Guide, originally what it did was it aggregated the endorsements of local progressive organizations across the state, actually mostly working at the statewide level. So they're, maybe based in Los Angeles or San Diego or San Francisco, but touching issues like housing, reproductive justice, etc., and aggregated those into a grid format and shared that as a decision-making tool. So with a state as large as California, or in fact with the US in general, education is such a key component of what we do, because unfortunately in this country, every voter we consider basically a low information voter, except for the folks who tend to turn out year after year after year, which is much older population, much whiter population than the overall population, much wealthier population. So in fact, when we talk about having representative elections, they have over the years become less and less representative, as we all have seen this year and the last 4 years with our federal administration. And so with this election, the opportunity was to take the Courage Voter Guide, which was just focused on these 12 propositions or so that happen every couple years, and look at all the races, all the candidates across the state. That would actually be practically, it's a monumental effort, because there's about 3,000, maybe 5,000 actually, elected offices in the state of California that could be on the ballot in a given year. This year, we were able to cover about 250 candidates. So in addition to the statewide measures, we also looked at some local measures, and then all of the state senators, state assembly members, the federal offices that were up, which is the members of Congress, and then selected local folks across the state. So what we did was basically build a resource that educated an average California resident about who was running in the race, and then made an actual recommendation. So there's also a big distinction here in California between what we can do as a C4 entity, which is a nonprofit entity, and a C3 entity. So both of those are nonprofit structures, but one allows you to take a position and advocate for someone to vote a certain way, and one doesn't. And because money is just so important in our political system, it carries so much weight. The C4 structure, it's much harder to fundraise through, but this is how you're able to actually make recommendations. So the way that we built those recommendations, I'm actually going to refer you back to Kelly's description of participatory democracy to kind of understand what we're building towards. So in coming up with these recommendations, we obviously didn't want to do it in a vacuum. And because of my background as a strategic designer and using a lot of the same kinds of activities and decision-making frameworks that are used in participatory democracy, we basically were able to kind of build a network using the network of these statewide partners. They each have local chapters, not all of them. So it's a variety of different types of organizations that we were working with across the state. But there's, so to give you a concrete example of one, there's a group called ACE, ACCE. It stands for something like the Alliance of Californians for Empowerment, Community Empowerment. And specifically what they do is they work on housing. They've been responsible for some of the most effective campaigns around organizing for tenants' rights, protecting tenants' rights in local communities across the state, as well as doing statewide advocacy. They have an amazing grassroots membership. And in fact, some of their members recently made the news for having occupied some houses in the city of Oakland that were abandoned, that were falling apart, and that were empty. And these mothers moved in and occupied them and made the point, you know, that we can't ignore, with the housing crisis in California as bad as it is, we can't ignore any property, which, you know, is very much controlled by the housing industry in California, the real estate industry. And so those members, out of those members, one of them actually ran for Oakland's, for Berkeley's Rent Stabilization Board and won her race. In fact, ACE had folks running across the state, and many of them won their races because they have this amazing presence in the community, and they really do recruit from local communities. So working with partners like ACE, we were able to source our recommendations on candidates. So not just at the state level, but at this local level, where then we're getting the folks who are authentically really driven to this work and have built relationships, which goes to the question of trust, which Kelly also mentioned. In terms of the structure, we created a research and writing program that was very light and flexible. So we were able to kind of bring people in around this very strong and structured workflow and project management system by which we vetted candidates in a first round and then would take them to kind of these different committees that we had to get insight, to get partner recommendations, and then to move forward with a final choice. So it's a huge program and a huge undertaking, but what we're hoping, because Courage also has an accountability program for legislators, where they put out a Courage scorecard, which evaluates legislators on how they actually perform in office. So essentially with the voter guide and with this accountability tool, we're pulling together kind of a comprehensive piece of infrastructure that is a layer between the state legislature and other local offices and the people. And the more that we can engage people in weighing in on these decisions, in building that pipeline of folks to actually run for office, and then we're holding them accountable as well in office, it's kind of a machinery that's being built, and that infrastructure we hope will build out over the long term. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Deepthi. And before we get to Kelly's next question, for those that aren't familiar with the sort of nonprofit structure in the States, the there's a long list of different types of nonprofits that you can be. So for example, RSA US is a 501c3 designation. So we cannot engage in any actual, like, fully partisan activities. We can't endorse candidates. We can't espouse a partisan view, but we are allowed to bring political points into the discussion without risking our nonprofit status. A C4 organization is allowed to actually campaign on behalf of a particular partisan issue, and there are a gajillion other designations besides. I just want to give that quick overview. But back to you, Kelly. At some point in your life with DemSoc, you moved to Belgium and to help establish their European network. What were the key differences between engaging with your fellow Scots and the broader European community, and what was similar?
Yeah, thanks. So yes, I did move to Belgium for a little while. I came back to Scotland in the end, but I moved there in 2017 when DemSoc made a decision to basically open an office in Brussels and to start to explore participatory democracy across Europe, but also within the European Union and within the European Union institutions, where really we felt that the conversation about involving people in decision and policy making was not developed enough as much as we would have liked to saw. So we saw a lot of opportunity and not really many other people or organizations going there to try and establish that conversation. So I would say I'll probably start with some of the similarities. So as an organization, we work in spaces with civil society. We're a civil society organization, so we're connected into those networks, into the groups that are advocating for different ways of doing democracy and involving people, as well as, you know, academia, think tanks, all that good stuff. But we're also advocates for participatory democracy, and we work with institutions who want to involve people in decision making. So that's helping governments and others to design or facilitate different processes. And I think there was certainly a lot of similarities really in needing to make the case and to support the development of kind of public understanding of the different ways that people could be involved in decision making. We often go into communities and start conversations about what people think about democracy, what democracy means to them. And we certainly found in a lot of the different spaces we were working in across different European countries, that people were starting from different places. A lot of people thought of democracy as representative democracy, elections, voting for people, whereas others had different understanding, of course. And I would say with the institutions, so the government, the European Union, we needed to go in and we needed to, as I kind of talked about before, say what are the benefits of involving people in decision making and kind of draw on evidence and examples to basically build a story of why it's beneficial for all different sorts of reasons. And of course, that case has had to be stated in Scotland too, but I think the understanding in Scotland has developed quite a lot, and I'll probably come on to that. We found a lot of institutional silos, both in Scotland, but also in the European Union. That is simply people not kind of having conversations among themselves, not really having conversations about where to focus energies of involving people in decision making, because of course, if you have lots of different people going out and requesting the time and energy of communities who already may be struggling to participate in many aspects of civic life, then that's an issue. So we're really interested in trying to connect conversations and getting people to work together and to collaborate rather than continuing to do stuff separately. Set ways of working and that kind of set policymaker mindset is a really difficult thing. So people have, I think, when they go into institutions and they kind of get involved in learning about how things work, they get quite set in the way that you go about working, about making policy. So again, there's a bit of taking people on a learning journey that we find happens in all of the spaces that we work with policymakers, to understand as well the different opportunities there are to involve people in decision making. And I think that is absolutely a shared experience we've found pretty much everywhere we've worked. So we're really big on trying to take people on a learning journey and to explain opportunities to involve people and why that could happen and how. I think a lot of these processes are still working through, at least the ones that are led by institutions or started by institutions, about that connection to social movement and civil society. They're still trying to figure out how that works. So a process like a assembly, for example, and there's two of them happening in Scotland at the moment, which we're involved with. Essentially what they do is they bring together a steering group of people who represent all different kind of aspects of life. They may be activists, businesses and others, to come together and kind of steward a process. And of course, when you have a group of people who are from civil society, who are activists, working with people in institutions and other settings, there's a lot of work that needs to happen in the space there, and to enter it into good faith, and I think to collaborate and come up with kind of different ideas about how processes should run and give that feedback. So I think that is a shared challenge that I think a lot of the climate assemblies are really illuminating at the moment. And I would say there are also lots of shared challenges in kind of being able to do rapid engagement. And I would say the experience of COVID has again illuminated that, knowing how to deal with mass public input of information. So you see some processes kind of inviting open public participation. People receive lots of input, and then teams aren't quite sure how to deal with all of that input and how best to handle it, essentially. And there are different ways, of course, that you can do that. I know the European Commission has a tool that uses AI that can support them with mass public consultations. Don't quite have that in the Scotland digital engagement team just yet, but there's lots of different ways you can work through that. But that synthesis, when you're inviting mass input and participation, really seems to be quite a challenge. And when you're talking about the scale of the European Union, so it was sad to read figures recently that have removed the UK from the number, but essentially 450 million people, and imagining a small proportion of that giving opinions and dealing with all of that is a challenge, of course. And then trust and polarization, that's happening across the piece at the moment, and there's a lot of effort. Where is there difference? So I guess it's a kind of a question of scale and level and relationships, rather than necessarily one of methods, because the same methods, to be honest, are being used in all sorts of different places. I've already touched on participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, all of those kinds of methods are being used in different places. Although, of course, being adapted for context. I think Scotland, I have found, has a better connection to some of the community feel and some of the sense coming up from the local level and community feeling than I found working with certainly the European institutions, but you can imagine how distant that feels, not least geographically, but in other ways from other people's lives. And you see that in all sorts of attitudinal surveys. And even living in Brussels, actually, I found my experience of local democracy there completely different to the way that people would interact or kind of relate themselves to the European Union institutions, even though they were just down the road. So yeah, there's certainly some differences there. And Scotland, is introduced legislation that I think underpins some of the work that's going on to develop a more participatory democracy, including Community Empowerment Act 2015, and there's been intentions set by the First Minister here. But I think where there is a really interesting difference at the moment, and Scotland, I think, is grappling with what to do with this, because we're looking at, looking forward to introducing a local democracy bill soon, is local democracy. I found it on a personal level really a very different experience living in Belgium, but in other spaces in Europe, in that people felt, so in Scotland, you have less representation, so elected representation per head of population than you do in a lot of other European countries. It was really interesting to me kind of how vibrant some of that local democracy was in different spaces. I experienced living in Belgium, but also in other places in Europe. And, as someone that moved to Belgium, it was amazing to receive a letter from my municipality, so from my commune, inviting me as a new resident to kind of come along and learn all about civic life, which is not something I sadly experienced when I moved to Scotland, but hey, maybe that's something people will be up for doing, and I imagine they would. It's a very welcoming place in that sense. But there was something there that I came back to Scotland feeling like that was lacking in kind of the vibrancy of local democracy. But there is so much, I think, good intention and will among civil society, and now increasingly in Scotland in government, to look at local democracy and to see what options we have to involve people. But there's something there about how you then connect those local spaces where we know people are more likely to engage no matter what subject you're talking about, because there is a level of comfort, there's a level of familiarity, and you're more likely to go over that threshold and engage in a space where you feel that kind of trust is already there. How do you connect that then to the different levels of power and where decisions are made? And that was something we kind of really became interested in when we were working across the different European countries. And now we're working on projects where we're thinking about how you have conversations in different European countries, and then you can kind of connect all of those conversations together and bring people together with translation support. And that translation support is super important. You don't want to work on the assumption that everyone's going to speak the same language, because that's excluding so many people, of course. And we are seeing that being done, and that kind of the tech behind the translation working pretty well, actually. So that's a new thing, though, that, you know, the massive, the different initiatives happening and how many are happening is certainly a new thing, but long may it continue. And I would just end on the similarity that I'm seeing in all of the spaces that we're working in with Europe, which is certainly greater interest and willingness to at least try different ways of involving people, even though, and I don't look at this in a way that's really starry-eyed, I have to say, you know, I think there's a lot of critique about how things play out, and, you know, involvement in a process doesn't necessarily mean being listened to or that things will be implemented. But at least that intention to try is a big similarity. But yeah, it's wonderful to have been working on this for a few years and to see that kind of progress, but it's throwing up all sorts of new challenges. And, you know, the one I mentioned is that then connection between civil society and kind of activism and these more formal institutional led processes and how we gel them together.
Thank you, Kelly. As I mentioned in the chat, 2 prepared questions left. So get your questions ready. We will just do it in a more popcorn style once we get to that point. But in the meantime, Deepthi, from your experience turning customer feedback into concrete new ideas, how can a voter guide help the citizenry see the fruits of their engagement? Which kind of dovetails on the question about not necessarily being heard, but not necessarily your thoughts being implemented. How have you seen it where that sort of feedback loop can be implemented?
Yes, so the work that I've done before this year has more recently been focused on the private sector. And so this gathering customer feedback and turning them into new ideas for new products and services, new ventures even, has been the focus of my work. And specifically at Thicket Labs, as I mentioned, we've developed a people-driven design platform. So a lot of the kind of technology pieces that go into that, they can be AI driven, but they're also part of just the kind of Q&A process, that feedback loop that is so important for creating improvement and innovation. And with a voter guide, there is an opportunity to build a similar feedback loop. And particularly that's the opportunity at Courage California, is really to be able to bring together the work that they're doing on accountability and holding legislators to account for their actions with the recommendations that are then being made of who to vote for. And so if individual citizens can be engaged in actually building the data set that we use to both evaluate legislators and also to make those recommendations, then that is something that can become part of that tool set of how we really do democracy in a modern age. And this is where I think, Kelly, you referred to some of those technology platforms that are out there. So the way that we have used our platform in the past, we actually brought together a collection of kind of public health professionals, as well as folks working in government, to do workshops and then kind of come together in a summit around women's wealth and health equity. So looking at how to protect and actually raise women's income and also opportunities to build wealth through, you know, home ownership is the big one in the US. And then also looking at the social determinants of health and understanding the ways in which that ends up impacting a woman's financial life. So in that case, we brought people together over the course of several months in these workshop settings, and the data that we were collecting through that went into the platform. And then on the at the summit, we were able to then have all of these rich ideas that people had brought to the table, and in real time be able to actually look, evaluate those those potential ideas, generate forecasts of the kind of collective impact that they could have, and then be able to kind of refine their recommendations. So at the end of this process, we actually had a public policy agenda that was at the national, state, and local level on these topics. And so by bringing that kind of technology into the voter guide, we think that we can do something similar where through phases, we would be able to then engage groups of citizens in whatever format is flexible, and then be able to kind of build the recommendations through that. There's already a lot of these kind of regular meeting formats that happen on a monthly basis, on a bi-monthly basis, that we can plug into seamlessly. So that's one side of it. And then the other side is really thinking about feedback on a large scale, thinking about it on a commercial scale, where we see millions of people really weigh in on new movies and TV shows, and really they can end up driving the development of those TV shows. So that's actually one of the other areas that we work in, is this kind of audience research space. And by creating some ongoing polling and really engaging people there, I think we can also amplify and get to scale in a way that doesn't kind of require the more infrastructure heavy, painstaking kind of creating that participatory process, but instead look at it as a more real-time, more seamless kind of experience of getting feedback, which will also help in terms of the spread of new ideas and information. So the media component of our platform is actually really something that we've focused on recently, because it's not just about the smaller spaces and formal spaces, it's also about getting to scale. And so we have basically, if you're familiar with the online quizzes that ask you, which Harry Potter house do you belong to? Take this quiz. We actually have that type of quiz format as part of the way that we gather feedback, so that people can actually take a quiz, not about the Harry Potter house, but maybe about, the neighborhood that they live in. And they're able to get some insight about their neighborhood, while also giving valuable information that can then be used for policymaking.
Thank you for that. So our last question, beginning with Kelly, I'm going to ask you to keep your answers within like 30 seconds, which I know is probably a hard task with this type of a question. But where do you two see your work progressing in your national context?
Okay, I'll start. So I suspect and I hope that there will be more participatory democracy. And I mentioned already the discussions happening around developments at the local level. But I think what's really interesting is one of the citizens' assemblies happening right now, which is a citizens' assembly on the future of Scotland, was looking at questions around what kind of country are we seeking to build, how do we overcome challenges facing Scotland and the world, and what further work needs to be carried out to give people information to make informed choices. And they've come up with a set of recommendations, which includes some really interesting stuff actually about how people should be involved in decision making in Scotland. So seeing what happens after that is, and how Parliament responds to that and the government responds to that is going to be really crucial, but it's really interesting stuff.
Thanks, Deepthi.
Well, in the US, it is definitely, there's the money is not in politics, in the sense that it's very hard to get support for participatory democracy. The investment in that is, I would say, low. And so we are going the commercial route much more to build this platform and be able to create a community and infrastructure that can weigh in on policy that is independent of any one organization.
Cool, thank you. So as I said, I am going to stop sharing my screen now. I invite you to move your Zoom window into gallery mode, or Brady Bunch mode, as I usually try to call it for my US friends, and invite you all. You now have the ability to unmute yourselves. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to jump in and ask them. And I'm very happy to wait in silence, but I knew Jonathan would have something to say. So go ahead.
Oh, you knew. And Diggs, just so you know, Brady Bunch has been syndicated around the world. You could probably see it at any time.
Fair point.
So thank you guys so much for sharing what you've been up to. And it really is, it's a huge feat. My question is, because I mean, I live in Los Angeles where we have the propositions where it is an absolute marketing ploy. Okay. So it's not, to me, it's more, it needs to veer from participatory democracy to responsible democracy. And where do you see us moving if we're not looking at, everything is so much in self-interest? How do we move the needle so it's about the community, it's about society, it's about not just right now, but 30 years from now? We can look at Prop 13 in California in 1973, I think it was, that, or a long time ago, talking about property taxes and how property taxes can't increase. So I could own a house living next to a person that bought in 73, and they're paying $1,000, though if they were to sell their house, it would be $1,000 a month in taxes, property taxes. If they were to sell their house now, the value would increase exponentially. So the new homeowner, that starter family that's just trying to get by, their rent for that same location is probably going to be around $15,000 a year, which then puts a burden on the tax. That's just one example of how a lot of things are very much about, how does this help me right now? I'm going to be, as long as it benefits me, I don't care. How do we move from that? What's the work that you guys are seeing done that can help move us from that?
Well, I can start. Absolutely. So with that particular situation, there was a property tax proposition on the ballot, Prop 19. And we did a lot of work actually on the communication side on all the statewide propositions to show this through line of, we called the campaign Follow the Money, because especially with those propositions, the narrative is so clear. You know, these industries kind of come together and just pour money into whichever position that they want folks to take. And then unfortunately, what I've seen this year is that we don't have a coherent and strong defense in that is in play on especially the progressive side. So in California, the particular landscape of kind of the political parties and how it works is the Democrats are actually the majority and have been for some time now. But unfortunately, within that, there's these kind of corporate or moderate Dems that we consider to be basically making decisions in the same exact way that Republicans do. And then we have the more progressive Democrats. So the progressive versus moderate becomes kind of really important in terms of how we understand and talk about these.
Deepthi, if I can just interrupt for one, just to bring color to it. Prop 19 was a proposition that was put forth to do away with part of what Prop 13 was, so that we would maintain that tax benefit for private customer, for people owning homes. But if it was a business property, Prop 19 was only about business property, to remove that protection if you own business, if it was a business property, so that your taxes could rise with the valuation of the property as opposed to a percentage increase. It's still lost. So the whole thing about and that was all of the public voting on these propositions, right? It wasn't just the liberals or the conservatives or what, it was everybody. And we know that in California, there are more liberals. A lot of people outside of California have it wrong, thinking that California is completely liberal, because there is a sizable conservative faction, but it's still one which goes to the point of the marketing and the self-interest. And so how do we get people out of self-interest?
Well, I mean, I wish I had an easy answer for you, but I think that we've been compromised over the years to a really frightening degree. I think, the way that we've seen the federal landscape be hijacked, and now it's a communications challenge, and it has been for a long time. Republicans poured a lot of money into think tanks that helped them develop the rhetoric and the ideas that then they have been spreading. They made the investment in the 70s, and they've been reaping the rewards since then. And that's how we have gotten to where we are today. To say that we can turn this around, um, is, I think, it's going to be extremely difficult, but at least we've stopped, we kind of stopped our descent into hell, as I've seen it referred to. But at this point, we have to present a new paradigm. We have to present a framework that isn't the old Republican versus Democrat kind of hewing to the same ideas that are aggressively being put out there, the same framing. When we respond, so this is when I talk about like a defense strategy. We have to have our own framing and our own kind of theories and ability to explain the logic of why this is important, that is independent of the arguments being put forth that are old, tired, and just make people tune out.
So can I ask Kelly, have you seen anything in the international scope outside of the US that might answer Jonathan's point, the question, and what Deepthi just said?
Yeah, I might take a different angle. I'm not sure how helpful or not it will be, and it is a very, very difficult thing to answer. But I think if you start from the point of believing that people should be involved in making, shaping decisions that affect their lives, and let's be honest, some people don't, but I certainly do, then you need to consider the support and the time that people need to have in order to be really meaningfully involved in that. And that includes having the opportunity to learn, knowing where to go to learn, because that kind of, now I was going to say old adage, but it's not really that old, of just Google it. To me, as someone who's also an educator, doesn't really stack up for a lot of people who struggle with kind of the information age and all that stuff that's kind of thrown out there and digging through it and stuff. So having a supported environment within which to explore, I think is really, really helpful. But also the lack of incentivized space. So why would people spend the precious time they have coming along to make a decision in the local community is a thing. So that's why with a lot of kind of these more formal, as it were, deliberative processes, a lot of thought is given to kind of breaking down some barriers to enable people to come together with a group of people that are really different to them, that have different experiences, that have different backgrounds, different views and opinions. And to support them, to be in that space, and that might be something as like providing childcare or a stipend so they don't have to go to work on that Saturday afternoon. But it's also ensuring that accessibility measures are in place, and that's, maybe providing information in easy read formats or earlier on or in a different way. And that you have a team of facilitators there who will enable them to come into that space and feel comfortable to listen and to learn and to sit with feelings that end up being really uncomfortable for people whose what they thought was their foundational knowledge and understanding of the world is kind of shook to the core by things they're hearing from other people who really don't agree with them, and that might be the first time they've really stepped outside that bubble. So there's something about providing the space and opportunity to do that, but there's also the supportive net of opportunities to learn around that too, and that's everything from coming into sessions that you might need to go through for 6 months to build up a confidence in public speaking, so even when you're in that small group setting you can say what you think and feel. And we've definitely been in settings where people have really taken quite a long time to be able to speak in a space like that. We can never work from the assumption that everyone can just come and say what they think and what they feel. So there's a lot of thought that we give to stuff like that. But then we know that, again, that issue of time comes up time and time and again. And I remember doing interviews with a lot of community learning and development workers in Scotland, specifically about, what do we need to do to get people involved in local democracy and whatnot. And time was the thing that came up consistently. and that supported environment. That kind of led to discussions, I think, about universal basic income as well. So there's some ideas really that are coming out about basically the way that society structure just fundamentally needs to change to enable people or masses of people to really take part. But we also see the loss of spaces where people would have informally gathered to have these kind of conversations that could have then led or sparked an interest, or that community engagement professionals or people could have connected into. So for example, we're losing a lot of youth spaces, so physical spaces where young people would come to meet. We're seeing libraries being shut down. We're seeing those groups where young parents or mothers might have gathered to get community support being lost as well. And I don't think we can kind of dismiss how important they were as well in maintaining some aspect of democratic life, because they allowed that informal meeting space and that possibility for people to connect into that space to tell people about stuff that was going on. So yeah, I think some of our minds are turning to, again, that idea of space, but also, how do we build community leadership, and how do we support people from different communities to go out and have conversations? And I think we are struggling with facilitator capacity, to be quite honest. So there's lots of interest in these processes, but there's not that many people that really have in-depth experience of running them, like designing them and facilitating them. And we're always looking for facilitators. So there's a capacity issue as well for this stuff to really be realized. But yeah, it is not an easy thing to answer. And I think we're all probably grappling with it.
Thanks, Kelly. I just want to give space and acknowledge that we do have an international audience. So if there's anyone from the European side of the world that has a question or comment, please do feel free to speak up now. Yes, Sarah? I can, there you go.
One of the things I'm interested in is, how do you actually measure your success? And do you find that with all of this work, it actually makes a difference to people in how they vote? Because one of the things that I'm watching avidly, the American elections, and I was quite stunned, like a lot of people in Europe were, at the eventual outcome of the election. So, sorry, that's my question.
Do you want me to take that first? So it depends on the process and what's being run. So if I take a citizens' assembly as an example, often a lot of the measurement is kind of around self-reported, kind of whether or not people are learning, changing their opinions, if they felt they've been able to contribute in a space and things like that. And there's some observational data. So a lot of the bigger processes, the national processes you see ongoing at the moment, you will expect some decent research to start coming out of those soon, and some comparative research. What is missing at the moment, which I think is a really important gap, is the longer term impact on both the individuals and the collective of the people that have participated in these processes, but also the communities around them that have watched those processes and seen whether or not things have been implemented or not, and if that increases or decreases or any of their engagement or trust in institutions. So there's a gap in the longer term research, I think, at the moment. Voting, no idea, to be honest. That's rarely a question that's ever asked. And in fact, that is that kind of like, who do you vote for, is often something you would not hear in a space that is a participatory or deliberative space. It's more kind of issues based rather than party political. But really, that's what researchers are looking at the moment. But as I said, there is a big gap about the longer term stuff. For me, as someone who's involved in the design and implementation, of course, that individual experience is important. And I'm always interested to know whether or not people have continued to be engaged, because a lot of these processes that bring people together on what we call a sortition or random selection basis, often people that take part are people that have never really taken part in processes like this before. It really is often people that are quite new to this sort of thing. I'm interested in whether or not what they've said has been implemented by decision makers or commissioning bodies for these processes. And for me, that is probably one of the most important metrics of success, because again, that can be either a relatively empowering or disempowering experience for the people that have taken part, and it could incentivize or disincentivize them from continuing to participate in democracy in the future. But yeah, that's my hot take.
Deepthi, a quick 30-second answer.
Yeah, I mean, I can just tell you that we're still crunching the numbers. In California, we won't have the certified results from the election until December. But the way that we evaluated our primary voter guide, which is where we launched it back in March, I can tell you that we invested heavily in Los Angeles because LA County has 1 in 4 California voters. So it's just a hugely impactful place for us to work. And there was a particular race that we heavily invested in, the District 2 Board of Supervisor race with Holly Mitchell running against Herb Wesson. And there we were able to reach 1 in 4 residents or 1 in 2 residents. I can't quite remember, it's been a little bit, but in that district. And so that's as far as we've been able to get in terms of measuring our real term results of who we've been able to reach. And then we haven't been able to close the gap to be able to actually then match it up with who people vote for. But through polling, we can tell that people's impressions of the candidate that we were recommending have steadily risen, and she actually won in a landslide in the general.
Sarah, we too in the States are asking a lot of the same questions. And my personal, which is definitely not scientific, but it seems that there's a huge I got mine mentality. And it goes to that self-interest, and it's, well, I've already achieved this, or I see myself in this, and so that's how I'm voting. Even and you look at the Cuban American community in Florida, they were told that Biden was socialist. They came from Cuba, and that's like PTSD. Even if they weren't born there, they might be second or third generation. There's that thing, even though socialism that people talk about with Biden is nowhere close to Castro's socialism, they were, even though Trump administration would never allow the boat lifts to happen, they would have all been turned back to die at whatever, they're already here. And so even if Trump is closer to Castro than to what a typical president is, they were more, to me, that was an illustration of well, I've got mine. I'm already here. My family's here. It doesn't matter that people that come from the same background that I might have had aren't able to do it. And I think as we look around at a lot of the data that's coming out, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, that's the beautiful thing of the US too, it's pervasive that it's self-interest and I've got mine.
Sorry, one thing, we just had the same problem with our Brexit, of course. It's a classic case.
Yeah, I think it's across society, unfortunately.
So just for the benefit of the tape, we can keep this conversation going. I just had to do this quick wrap up and stop the recording, but just to say thank you all for being here. Thanks to Deepthi and Kelly. There will be some additional information coming to participants who are signed up through Eventbrite. If you want to get more information, you can email us directly at general.us@thersa.org. Thank you for watching.